I'm a professor at Biola University in La Mirada, California, and I'm also a member of the Biblical Studies and Theology Department and also co-director of the Winsome Conviction project with my good friend Tim Yohoff. Tim?
Thanks, Rick. I'm a communication professor at Biola University, and I teach a class on persuasion, Rick. And this past summer, a man named TJump out of nowhere just kind of sent me an email saying, hey, I'd love to talk about atheism, theism, the existence of God, the ramifications of that. And would you like to come on my YouTube channel? So I said, yes, but let's actually do it during my class, my Christian persuasion class. And Tom was gracious enough to say, yeah, let's do that. And then Tom actually stuck around afterwards to address my class, which I greatly appreciated. So TJump is a YouTube, has a YouTube channel where he brings on Christian theologians, Christian philosophers, and not just Christian philosophers, but people who like to think deeply about topics. Tom's been doing this for roughly 5 years. We had a very interesting exchange live during my class and then had a wonderful conversation afterwards. So we thought, let's bring Tom onto our podcast so we can absolutely ambush him. No, Tom, absolutely kidding. But Tom, welcome to the Winsome Conviction podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. It was great talking with you last time. I was kind of looking forward to the ambush thing. I get a lot of views from those. So,
well, maybe not. We'll have to just kind of play this by ear. But Tom, you're brand new to our listeners. And Tom, just to set up a little bit what this podcast is about is we are co-directors of something called the Winsome Conviction Project, where we want to, in a very civil way, engage diverse perspectives. And I know that's your heartbeat as well, looking at the people that have been on your YouTube channel. So we wanted to first use the first segment to kind of get your backstory a little bit of your journey. I know you grew up in a Christian home, or at least a religious home, and then you kind of moved away from that. Can you just give our listeners a quick backdrop of why this issue is important to you and a little bit of your journey?
well, I think those are two slightly different questions. So my journey away from Christianity was because I had major depressive disorder, had it for about 2 decades. And I was praying day and night, having been brought up Christian. I went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, mass like twice a week, ridiculous. And so I was taught that there was this all-loving being out there who cared about me more than I could possibly imagine, more than anything in the world. But having prayed morning and night every day, read the Bible cover to cover, and asked for help to alleviate my depression and getting no help whatsoever, I stopped being able to believe there was such an all-loving being out there. I didn't identify as an atheist at this point. This was sometime near the end of high school, 17, 18. And it wasn't until about 4 or 5 years later when I got into philosophy that I started to learn about the position of atheism and the arguments and the new atheists, Hitchens, Harris, Dawkins, and Dennett, and started to really identify with the label of atheism. So my transition away from Christianity had more to do with unanswered prayers, and my transition to atheism had to do with the philosophical arguments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that's actually a helpful and probably an interesting and important distinction, I imagine, at least for you experientially on all of that part. And what are, as you look back at it, what are the things that seemed? I'm curious about the middle ground you just identified. You know, you'd moved away from the Christian faith, and then 4 or 5 years later, you hit some arguments with atheism that made you drawn towards atheism. What happened in between times? What were some of the things that you were kind of wrestling with in the midst of that? Tell us a bit about that part of your story.
Well, my questions about God's existence kind of faded away in that point because I was still battling depression and I was trying different things to overcome it. So, like exercise was a big one. I lost about 200 pounds. I was up to 340, and then got down to like 160. I started doing.
Hang on. You were what? How much?
340 pounds.
Because I'm looking at a picture right now. That is utterly amazing what you did.
Yeah. There's a picture of me on my passport. I look like a gigantic potato. It's very entertaining.
Wow. Hey, that's awesome.
Unfortunately, it did not work to solve the depression at all. So that was one of the things that was downside. And so I got into research. I started researching neurology, biology, evolution, origin of the universe stuff. That was one of the later stages of my trying to cure depression. And that's where I got introduced to more of the philosophical arguments. But over the course of that 4 or 5 years, I had tried a bunch of different things, going to school, computer science, programming, friends and family, travel, all in an effort to try to cure my depression, and none of it had worked. And I eventually ended up trying philosophy and science and stuff as my next go-to experiment. And that's what led me to the atheist side of things.
And how did that work out relative to the depression? Did you find that helpful, or was it did that still operate on kind of a different track?
Nope, completely useless. All of the things I listed, completely useless.
I mean, I don't want to. I'm not surprised. It seems like that's part of the thing with depression, is that it kind of has its own track in life. So yeah, I
Well,
was curious.
sort of. For me, I was diagnosed with high functioning autism, and people
Mm.
with autism have a special interest, and that special interest is like the most important thing in the world to them, and it can have a profound emotional impact on their life. And for
Huh.
me, finding out what my special interest was and achieving it was what cured my depression. So I have not had any depression for a little over a year now. And so it was more about figuring out what it took for me to cure my depression, and none of the things I tried were even in the right ballpark.
Huh. So what was it? What was your special interest?
Physical relationships with very attractive women.
Okay. And that's cured and solved the problem?
Yep, so far, it's as long as I have a consistent relationship, I seem to be good emotionally.
Yeah.
Tom, I resonate with this because I'm a migraine sufferer. I've been suffering from migraines for 20 years, and I have
And hot
prayed.
blondes also cure your thing too, is that it?
No, a hot redhead, by the way. You can actually look her up. Her name's Noreen Muehlhoff, and 32 years has been awesome. But for 20 years, I've struggled with pretty bad migraines, and I've prayed the exact same prayer that you did, that God would simply take it away. And again, I believe everything that you said at the beginning, that God is powerful, concerned, and is certainly able miraculously to take away my migraines. Well, that simply hasn't happened. But it's manageable because of migraine medication. Also, exercise, if you're a migraine sufferer, is incredibly important to keep you balanced. So I guess we came at different conclusions. I wrote a book. My most recent book is called Eyes to See, Discovering God's Common Grace in an Unsettled World. And so I view common grace as my migraine medication, my talented neurologist, who, by the way, isn't a Christian, as a way of God's good gifts. But you kind of, if I get this right, didn't credit him or God with the fact that exercise can help, or that fact that you can use the internet to do research and consult different experts. So you see how you and I kind of went two different directions. I attributed that to the good gifts of God, though disappointed, and in some ways still disappointed he hasn't taken away my migraines miraculously. But you kind of went the other way of moving away from God because he didn't take away your depression. So what would your answer to prayer look like if God would have answered it? Would it just been a complete eradication of depression in your life?
No, I prayed for things more simple than that. Anyone who I could feel loved from was kind of more or less what I was going for. Any kind of close human relationship was pretty low bar I was asking. So any close relationship that made me feel loved was what I was going for. So I didn't actually know the word depression back in my early childhood. So I was just asking for
Right.
the thing that I felt I needed, which was a loving relationship of some kind.
Mm.
And that's what it would have taken for me to feel like my prayers was answered, was to actually find that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are things that, you especially as a child, that sounds like a very reasonable expectation, to put it simply.
Yeah.
And I can understand the defeat and hurt when that reasonable expectation isn't met.
Because you had a great exchange with one of my students who said that she struggles with depression to this day as a follower of Christ. But I thought that was an interesting moment between you two, where you both just recognized, hey, we've been in the same camp when it comes to the struggle with depression. Um, hey, so let's move on just a little bit to, it's one thing to study philosophy. It's another thing to say, hey, I'm going public. I'm going to start a YouTube channel and kind of do my math in front of everybody. And so what was the inclination towards taking this thing public and actually doing a YouTube channel where there could be the potential of, other Christian thinkers or people who disagree with you kind of disagreeing with you and making points in front of a live audience? Like what was the inclination in that direction?
Laziness.
How so?
Okay, unpack that for us. It sounds like a promising opportunity, but
Yeah. So I was asking professors out to coffee and recording the conversations on my phone. And these recordings, like an hour-long conversation on philosophy, is fairly in-depth. I couldn't just remember it on my own. I had to record it. And I didn't want to like store all this on a 2 terabyte hard drive that cost at the time $200, like a waste of money. YouTube is free. I can just download YouTube, say, hey, just upload it here. We're done. And I don't have to do anything. And instead of actually going into the settings and turning everything to unlisted, I was like, I don't care. I'm just going to upload it there and keep it there because it's easy. I don't have to do any effort. It's incredibly simple. And people started to watch and then send me money and then send me a considerable amount of money. So I was like, all right, I'll just do this now.
so that's interesting. You backed into it, not what it was a side effect, in effect, of your personal interest about this question, your desire to kind of pursue it.
Yep.
But putting yourself out there, so we kind of relate being podcasters, but we're also, Rick and I have written books, and when you write books, you get reviewed, and those reviews are not always, let's just say, jump up and down, excited reviews. But any hesitation of putting yourself out there, where I've listened to a ton of your debates, Tom, and there's been a handful where some of your guests have gone after you, I think in kind of inappropriate ways, but they've really tried to go after you in front of God, country, and everybody. There wasn't any hesitation about doing this publicly in front of live audiences?
No, one of the advantages of autism is that you aren't really as susceptible to what other people think of you. And so I would never really cared what people insulted me or made fun of me. It didn't bother me all that much. And so whether or not people agreed with me never really interested me. And an additional benefit of that is hate comments boost the YouTube algorithm. And so when I see a hate comment or people who are haters, I love them. I don't ban them. I promote their comments because I want them to comment more, especially when they send super chats to make fun of me. It's phenomenal. Like, thank you for the money. I appreciate it. So haters, I've always appreciated because it gives me a boost to my channel.
Okay, Tom, you realize that's not making us feel better. I mean, like about the cosmos, about the algorithm and all that kind of stuff. But
May I remind you, welcome to the Winsome Conviction project. But Tom, can I pick up on that a little bit? Because so during our conversation, I purposely didn't have the chat feature on. I didn't ever see it. But my students were watching the chat feature
Yep.
as the entire conversation was happening. Now, I know this happened. Well, it happened November 14th. We're not sure when this podcast will air. But I walked away, felt like you and I did pretty well relationally. I mean, I didn't walk away ever feeling like Tom was attacking or I'm jumping on Tom. I mean, didn't you kind of feel like your recollection of it, walking away from that? I thought we did pretty well relationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then to see the chat, because then I went back, because this is me, right? It's like we have this horrible website, Tom, called ratemyprofessor.com. And it's like, you should never go there. Well, of course I go there, right, to see. And I like to just say to the audience, I have 3 hot tamales. I don't know what that means, but I have 3 hot tamales, which is a good thing, apparently.
How many? Like 1,000?
Well, now, Tom, why
don't wow.
I don't know. I'm going to Google it right now. Hang on. No,
I think it's 5, actually. I've been on there. I believe it's 5.
Okay, well, that was crushing. So, Tom, because we do take very seriously the Winsome Conviction Project, and we do feel like America has been brought into what Deborah Tannen, a Georgetown linguist, calls the argument culture, and that this argument culture is really threatening, in some ways, the fabric of our country. 98% of Americans in a Pew Research study said that incivility is a threat to this nation. So I was discouraged about the chats because I felt like they were pretty attacking, inflammatory. So that was a weird moment for me, just to be really honest. Is one, I think I had a great, like, this conversation I think is awesome, but then to go to the chat, that was troubling to me and discouraging, and thinking, I don't know. It made, for the first time, me question coming on your YouTube channel. This is me being just honest, because that chat, if this is what it's fostering, I see that as a negative, not a positive. So it's interesting to hear you kind of take a different, more functional perspective of the chat box.
Well, I think it serves a number of valuable purposes. So one is a way to blow off steam and to be with a group of people who have suffered in the same way you have. So a lot of people in the atheist community left because of trauma that they suffered in churches and in religious communities. And they can identify that trauma with certain statements that are very common among religious apologists. And so they attribute the same malice of what they suffered to anybody who utters the similar statements, even if the person doesn't have that malice. And so I think a lot of them can relate and connect in a community of people who have similar experiences through this medium and also blow off steam. It's very cathartic to do these kinds of things. There was actually a study on cursing where if you stubbed your toe and you started to curse after, it would literally lower your pain threshold, both physically and emotionally. And so you'd feel less pain. And the more virulent the curse, the more pain it would reduce. And so there's a level of emotional release that happens in these kinds of communities, in addition to an amount of connecting with similar people who have similar experiences, that I think is actually a very good positive thing that comes about, even though the expression of which may be very perceived in a very negative way.
So can I push back on that just a little bit? Because
Sure.
I would agree with you on the one hand. I don't doubt for the in-group that is a stress releaser and could even be a unifying factor for the in-group. But that's kind of like saying, okay, so Republicans get to rip Democrats because they're angry at what Democrats are doing to this country. So when Republicans get together, they just kind of blow off steam, and the more they curse, the better they feel. Well, if Democrats do the exact same thing, then the overall communication climate of our country greatly suffers. So I would say I have no doubt that lowers the temperature of your in-group. And by the way, my in-group could be susceptible to this as well. But the difference between us, Tom, might be, so if Biola students were doing in the chat what your group was doing, we would be reeling in these Biola students. We'd be saying, hey, this is not speaking truth and love. And it's the love part that greatly concerns us at the Winsome Conviction Project. So I don't doubt that it lowers the steam and the cursing helps the toe, but it also is alienating you from the group that may have stepped on the toe. And now you got two groups who are going after each other and they're feeling better, but the communication climate suffers.
I'm not sure exactly, because I don't see one as a bad thing. I see them both as good things. And so they're kind of like salt and pepper. If you get rid of one, you're lowering the level of diversity of the kinds of conversations you can have. So for example, there's definitely clearly in groups and out groups that are meant to be cathartic, like Fox News and CNBC. That's all they are. They're just playing to their base to make them feel good, and aren't really trying to be an impartial analysis of data. But the ones that are attempting to be impartial analysis of data do very poorly in the polls. They don't get a lot of attention. Very few people watch them because there are these bubbles that people get into. They go into their in-group and they don't usually get exposed to contrary data because they don't enjoy it. They don't want to. They're not interested in hearing that. And it takes a very specific type of person to be interested in going into the other person's in-group and talking about those topics, or trying to find a neutral ground where you can talk about them without insulting people. And I think that our conversation was an example of a space where we could do that. But that space was then surrounded by, of course, the in groups and out groups, sort of like a Venn diagram where you get the two bubbles and there's a little space in the middle that's like red, and then one that's blue and purple or whatever. I think that YouTube conversations are kind of like doing that. And I don't think isolating one of the groups and saying you're not allowed to be in that bubble and make fun of the other group would necessarily be a benefit to the conversation. I think that it's good to have all of the spaces available for any group to be a part of. So like, as I mentioned, I have haters. There are groups of Christian haters who come into the chat and are unified against us and start debating with the atheists in my chat. And so I like to have all three opportunities, or all three groups, be able to participate at the same time, rather than trying to isolate one and say it's bad or shouldn't be a part of the conversation.
Let me pick up on one thing you said right at the beginning of this little exchange that I thought was actually really insightful, and I appreciate you pointing this one out. You mentioned the idea that you may have a good number of people in your kind of atheist, I don't want to call it clientele, whatever group, that have been really hurt by experience they've had at church or whatever. And so when they hear someone, how did you put it, quoting one of the phrases or things like that they associate with that hurt, you get a whole bunch of pus that comes out, so to speak, in terms of the process. And as you mentioned, kind of a cathartic cleansing sort of a thing. And as you're saying, I thought, that is a good insight, because I think that's kind of a human phenomenon where you hear these things and they become triggers for your whole set of experiences. And a lot of times, just in like normal exchanges about just anything, somebody will say something and you read it like, that was exactly what my dad used to say.
Mm.
And you give them the full-blown dad reaction, and they're sitting there going, I have no idea why this person just blew up at me. And it's got a better reason behind it than you might think. It isn't necessarily an objective, rational reason as much as it is an experiential, emotional, personal reason. But the point is, it isn't a person just being an angry lunatic. It's a person being hurt, and you having triggered a prior hurt by exactly saying the thing that had been in the context that hurt him earlier. Have I heard you right on that? Is
Yes, there
yeah.
are actually two very prescient examples of that in today's society. One would be saying trans women are not women is considered instantly transphobic by many people on the left, which it shouldn't be, because there are legitimate arguments of that. Some people culturally use the word woman to be a biological term rather than a psychological gender association. That's perfectly rational. And so it isn't inherently transphobic to say trans women aren't women. Whereas on the left, anybody who says that will be labeled a transphobe instantly. Same thing with 1350. It's considered a racist dog whistle to bring up those stats in conjunction, because African Americans are 13% of the population, but commit 50% of the murders. And so anybody who brings up those statistics is instantly considered racist. But when you Google those statistics, they are correct. It is FBI crime data. It is the true stats. And so simply labeling anyone who brings up those terms as racist is a hasty generalization fallacy, because there are legitimate criticisms that are non-racist, non-sexist, transphobic, whatever derogatory term you want to use. And it would be better to not immediately label anybody who uses those terms and demonize them simply because some people who use those terms are bad.
Yeah, no, well said. Hey, one quick advice for us. We're going to wrap up our first segment. We're going to have a whole nother segment with TJump. Tom, I need to get a handle like that. Why don't I have I could be TJump. No, I don't know. Hey, Tom, what's your advice to us as you speak to the Christian community, not to fall prey to what you just said? Like, what would be some common things that we do that you think triggers your community pretty quickly? I think that'd be great for us to hear.
Oh my God, how long do we have?
Well, that's why we left this to the very end of the podcast
That's
segment.
discouraging. You have 30 seconds. That's how open we are to your input. No, take a few minutes. I'd love to hear this.
Well, so the reason I actually started to look into these more social issues like the 1350 and trans women are not women is because I saw the same kind of bias there as I do in many of the arguments that Christians use. So one of the things is evolution. For example, many Christians say anybody who advocates for evolution is doing so because of work of the devil, or you left Christianity because you just want to sin, or Jesus is really the solution to all of your problems. These kinds of very general statements made by Christians are suffering from the same kind of hasty generalization that the people on the left are using when they identify someone who says a statement they disagree with and then associate it with the bad guys. Of course, the bad guys in Christianity is like Satan, And from the left perspective, anybody who's a Nazi is essentially the Satan of the left, more or less.
Right.
And so I see the same kinds of generalizations, which is a part of human nature, being applied for any kind of ideology that you think is holier than thou. It's a little sanctimonious in a way, where you think you have the absolute authority on what is right and moral. And then if anybody goes against that, they're evil, and you have to stop considering what they're saying. And I believe I heard in one of your talks on YouTube that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't just immediately demonize someone. You should consider what they're saying and rationally analyze it to see if there's anything good there. And I totally agree with that and think that is the correct way to analyze what the person is saying, independent of who they are, what they are, and assess the statement in and of itself, to find out if it's true, regardless of who says it.
Cool. Maybe you could do marketing for us.
Absolutely. I charge $500 an hour.
Oh, bummer.
Okay. Hey, Tom, we're going to do another segment because you have some very interesting ideas that we want to explore about morality, particularly. And we thought it'd be really fun to unpack some of those and have a conversation. So thank you for agreeing to come on to our second segment. Hey, what can our listeners, how can they find out more material about you and access to your YouTube channel? What's the best way to do that?
Well, my OnlyFans is, oh, just kidding. My YouTube is youtube.com/TJump. That's where I do most of my debates and things. Check me out there. It's pretty easy to find. Just Google TJump, TJUMP. It is not Trump, even though it's spelled very similarly. I got a lot of flack from Google
I
on
can
that
only
one.
imagine. Yeah.
Oof. But yeah, youtube.com/TJump. That's the main place. Check me out. Please send me money. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Winsome Conviction podcast. And you can, we'd love to have you join us regularly. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Play or wherever it is that you normally get your podcasts. And you can also check us out at the winsomeconviction.com website for more resources and other articles that help us look at the issue of how we carry forward our public conversations. Thanks so much for joining us. Boom.
Boom.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Tom. That was great.
Yeah, absolutely.
would-
It was fun.
Good stuff.
And I appreciate a couple of the comments you made there. That was really helpful. The things we had right at close. I would have loved to. We really did want to talk about the other part. We were not cutting you off on that because that was uninteresting. That was really super. And so anyhow, appreciate those
Thank you.
those thoughts.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to jump into another segment. Unfortunately, we have a hard stop at 10 o'clock. We got this Zoom meeting that Rick and I just have to be a part. So we have to get the studio whenever the studio's open. So that's why we jumped on this spot. All right, so we're going to jump right in, Tom, and then thought it'd be kind of fun. He's a philosopher. Kind of fun to have you guys have a little bit of a conversation. I'll jump in as well. Okay, so here we go. Rick, do you want to? Okay.
Tim, why don't you do the lead-in part, and then I'll just pick up after
Great.
that. And
Great.
chat with Tom.
Producer, we ready to go?
Ready to go.
Awesome, thanks. Welcome to the Winsome Conviction podcast. My name is Tim Muehlhoff. I'm a professor of communication at Biola University in La Mirada, California. Thank you for joining us on the Winsome Conviction podcast. I'm not alone. I have my good friend, co-host, co-director of the Winsome Conviction Project, Dr. Rick Langer. Rick.
Thanks, Tim. And I am a professor here at Biola as well in the Biblical Studies and Theology Department. And as Tim mentioned, we work together on the Winsome Conviction Project, where we're trying to do things to help promote more civil discourse and better understanding across divisions and divides we have about really important areas of conviction. It's often easy to disagree about mere matters of taste. Even I'm a Denver Broncos fan. I live in the land of people who are like the Chargers and the Raiders around here. And these are like my arch enemies, right? But the bottom line is we really don't have that many outrageous or difficult conversations about our football teams. They're kind of matters of taste. But when it comes to things like, well, let's just be blunt, religion and politics, it's different. And we tend to have a very hard time crossing those boundaries. So Tim and I have been having a fun conversation with TJump, who's an atheist and has been active in his own YouTube channel, debating people and talking about these sorts of issues that really do engage some of the areas where it's really hard to have a disagreement. So we've had a great conversation with him and wanted to continue that by talking just a little bit more about some of the things that have been a challenge for him in terms of Christian belief, because of course, Tim and I do have Christian belief. So there's a big gap there. So Tom, thanks for joining us for these conversations.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Um, One of the things that I was intrigued by that you mentioned in terms of your own story of kind of having growing up in a Christian context and being disappointed with God because of struggling with deep depression, asking what seemed like very kind of simple, modest requests, so to speak, of God, and not having those prayers answered, and really ending up going through a process where you kind of lost your faith. You didn't go immediately into atheism, but you kind of went through a bit of a wilderness, so to speak, until you found some of the atheist arguments that ended up, kind of making sense to you. So we had talked a little bit about that, and one of the things that I got to thinking about this was, let me just frame it this way, and I'll let you respond to this. Um, it seems clear to me that what you experienced was what I'm going to call for the moment a failure of your God construct. In other words, you had a way of understanding and having a set of expectations about God, and God did not deliver. And it seems to me like that could be a bit like the failure of a bridge. It can fail because there's no such thing as bridges, or construction really doesn't work to cross, big divides like you have for the Golden Gate Bridge or something. Or it can fail because you failed to construct a good bridge. The failure could be of the construct, or the failure could be of the concept, if you know what I mean. And it seems to me important to separate those two things. And so that was what was going on in my mind as you were talking about some of that. And I was just, it sounds like defeated expectations that you had were things about God just intervening at a minimal level to provide just basic, in your case, basic love, relationships, something meaningful, some positive contributor in your situation. And let me just pause here and let you respond to both my general idea of that, and then also those details. Make sure they're right before I go ahead.
Yeah, I think it sounds right. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. Wait, so let me just run with that a little bit. One of the things that is interesting that I've noticed, now I was a pastor for 20 years before I became a professor. So I spent a lot of time talking with people who were experiencing any variety of things, very much depression included. And people would often come to me with doubts or questions about God. And one of the things that seemed to kind of haunt people was defeated expectations. And I began to realize there's kind of two different ways you could draw expectations from your Christian faith. One would be things you might call an extrapolated expectation. God is good, God is omniscient, and God is all powerful. And therefore, if there's a good, all powerful God, he knows my suffering. And therefore, if he's truly good, he has the power and would have the will, because of his benevolence, to intervene on my behalf. So if God isn't doing that, he must either not be omniscient, he must not be benevolent, or he must not be omnipotent, that he can't do anything about him. But somewhere there has to be a break like that. So you have a clear expectation, it defeats the syllogism, so to speak. And so you conclude out of a process like that there is no God. And I've talked to a lot of people who have had that sort of an experience. And like I say, it's kind of extrapolating the expectation. Or you read a verse in the Bible that says, make your requests be made known to God, and, cast all your anxieties upon him because he cares for you. But you don't have that happen. And those are what I call extrapolated expectations. And it's pretty common for those to be defeated. God doesn't do what you expected.
So my initial thoughts are is those I think those are two separate things. One is the philosophical justification for a disbelief or something, which is a conclusion based on a syllogism or whatever. And I think that that mostly doesn't happen. I think very few people are affected by that. I think they will justify their change with those after the fact, because there was a study done on people on how they justify the decisions they make, where they gave them a bunch of pictures, say pick picture A or picture B, and then they'll put the things you picked in a pile, and later they're going to ask you, well, why did you pick this one, or why did you not pick this other one? And they're going to slip in some of the ones you didn't pick, and they found out that people are going to justify even the ones they didn't pick as ones they picked for certain reasons. And so
They
people
can drum up a reason to give an account.
Yep, exactly. And so people will make up reasons of why they change their mind. And so one of the reasons are these syllogisms like, oh, well, I expected an all powerful being to do X and he didn't, therefore I stopped believing. Really, it's more emotional than that.
Yeah.
Like my conversion away from theism was more just because God didn't answer my prayers. It's kind of like trying to talk to a milk carton. If the milk carton does not talk back, eventually, whether you realize it or not, you're going to stop believing the milk carton has a consciousness. You're going to be like, it's just a milk carton. And that's kind of what happened for me in my belief in a God. I was trying to talk to this non-spatial temporal milk carton, and it never talked back. It never did anything, good or bad, of any kind. And so I stopped, just eventually just ceased being able to believe there was such an entity there. And the emotional facts of, because I was in desperate need of certain kinds of responses, just made that process significantly faster. Later on, when I got into the philosophy and I could actually analyze the philosophical arguments and make the syllogisms to understand why they're justified, I think that's a separate topic. I think like there is a justification for saying that an all good, all powerful being wouldn't drown babies or something along those lines. And so, given the context of the Old Testament, if it's true and the world was flooded, definitely you can kind of rule out an all powerful God from that one, because there's logically possible alternatives that are less immoral or something along those lines. But I do think those are two pretty much unrelated questions of why people initially do leave, which is more emotional, and then the justifications they give, which are these logical ones, which aren't usually post hoc in some way.
Yeah, actually, I think I'm inclined to agree with you on that. At the very least, how related the two tracks are, I think, maybe in subject debate, because I think there are some connections, but I think you're right. There's two different things that are often going on there. And one of the things, and this is perhaps more of a comment for our listeners even than for you, Tom, but one of the things that strikes me with that is that there's a second way of generating your expectations, so to speak, when I think of this biblically, Christianly, is what do I expect of God? I can kind of do a philosophical reasoning approach to that, or I can do a read the story approach to that, where you suddenly discover, and this is awkward, this is hard when you read the Bible, but you realize, oh, people asking God, how long, oh Lord? How long are you going to basically not answer a prayer? How long are you going to defer intervention? And you suddenly realize, wow, there's a huge portion of the Psalms, all kinds of imprecatory Psalms, but also Psalms of lament and things like this. You find that being a common cry of the prophets. How long? You read the book of Lamentations and you see Jeremiah asking those kinds of questions. And whatever the philosophy and theology is, the bottom line is the experiential part of people of faith historically has been full of those moments. And actually a big part of faith is figuring out how to navigate those moments successfully. And if you just walk into the Bible reading what kind of human experience is discovered there, you end up with a really different set of expectations about what might happen within your own life than if you say, let me take these three attributes of God and extrapolate. And as I think you pointed out, they simply are two different tracks. And I do think that it's helpful to have that clear in people's minds to say, yeah, whatever the story is of our philosophy, it often washes really differently than the narratives we see when we just look at Scripture itself. Not talking to TJump the atheist, but just talking to Jeremiah. So that to me is an interesting. Any comments you have on that before I move on to some other things?
Yeah, there's two things there. One is if you read the Bible and read the diversity of different ways God reacted to different people, some he did pretty instantly. He hardened Pharaoh's hearts. That didn't take very long. He flooded the world. That didn't take very long. He's turned what's her name to salt. That didn't take very long. So he does instantly give responses occasionally. And some he gives delayed responses. Some he gives positive things. Some he gives negative things. And it seems like the diversity of potential interactions creates an unfalsifiable criterion that anything that happens to you, you can say, well, this is what God meant to happen, and there's no way to falsify that God was actually doing something or not doing something here, which I would consider a bad epistemology. I don't consider that to be a reliable way to do things. The second thing is I don't really think that people create expectations for God. I don't think that's a thing. I again think that's more post hoc. I think that people's belief is more kind of like a pain threshold where if you interact with someone enough, there's this spectrum for any individual. If you interact with this person, they will like you in 5 minutes. If you interact with this other person, it'll take 5 days. Take this other person will take 5 years, etc. And so different people have different levels of requirements of interaction before they really trust and care about you. And when you pray to, say, a milk carton, some people will stop believing in 5 minutes, some people 5 years, etc. And I think the same thing applies to the Bible here. It's not that people have created these expectations, it's more that the way their brain works because of who they are, their neurology, is going to mean that they require a certain level of interaction to have faith or trust in anyone or anything. And since God does not interact at a particular level, there is a certain demographic of people below some threshold who will never be able to believe or trust in such a being because it doesn't interact at the amount that their brain requires for them to trust in. And so I don't think it's that they've created false expectations. I think the expectations they've created are a reflection of who they are as individuals and the amount of attention they need as individuals to feel valued enough to really engage in a relationship. And so I think that again, that whole one of the things of saying that people have created expectations and they haven't been met is a kind of thing that I think Christians do that is in a similar vein as the trans women are not women, where it's kind of making a judgment on those individuals rather than reading in the fact that that is a representation of who they are and the kind of interactions they need to feel valued.
And the only thing I would say about that, Tom, is that the vast majority of the world has expectations about God, a higher power, that are being met. This is something I mentioned in my conversation with you, that roughly 85% of the world's population believes not just in God, but a organized religion, and that has been true of humanity since the beginning of time. Now, that's what's so wild about our conversation, Tom, is I find that really interesting fact that gives me pause that we have been inherently religious since the dawn of recorded history. And that doesn't give you pause at all. It doesn't seem like that gives you any type of pause that the vast majority of humanity conceptualizes God, has expectations, and feels relatively those expectations are being met.
No, for the same reason that poor people tend to buy more lottery tickets. It's that if you are in a desperate emotional situation, you tend to invest more in long shots out of necessity because you need a long shot. Whereas people who are in a more stable position, like wealthier nations, Norway, Japan, Denmark, Sweden, etc., very few of them are religious. So they don't invest in the same kind or don't have an emotional need for the safety net of a God. Whereas people who are in impoverished countries, which is the majority of the world, as you pointed out in our last conversation, are still in a very harsh situation. And so the fact that they cling to the safety net, emotional safety net, is a very rational thing to do in a way. And I don't find it surprising one bit. I would find it surprising if we solved all of our needs, cured death, no longer needed food, and people continued to remain majority religious. That I would find very surprising.
Let me go back to your milk carton illustration. This is kind of following up on what Tim asked, but just in a slightly different angle. When you give that illustration, I'm kind of like, wow. So I literally don't know anyone who talks to a milk carton. I'm sure there are people like that, but I literally don't know and never even heard of anyone who talks to a milk carton. So it seems like kind of a bad analogy for trying to figure out what people are doing when they pray, because I'm like, it's kind of a non-starter. Back to Tim's point, where you have 85% of the people, and even in modern countries, you have people who are praying very much in the United States at 90% levels who will find themselves praying to God regularly. So do you think you have a slightly better analogy option you could come up with than like a milk carton or a UFO or a unicorn that just seems completely, I
Sure.
literally know no one who thinks that way, but I know almost everybody who does include prayer as some sort of viable option. And what is going on in a human soul that we do operate that way seems puzzling to me.
Sure. Volcanoes, stars, horseshoes, hurricanes, meteorites, planets, the wind, fire, water, air, the ether, every
So
single one of
getting
the
your drift.
yeah. So,
Okay.
so the point is just that the milk carton was meant to represent an object which people can imagine has some kind of sentience or consciousness or ability to interact, and people will pray to it in an effort to engage with that consciousness. And the point of the milk carton is that it's something we know that does not have consciousness, but the analogy was meant to show that some people will continue to pray to it for longer before they lose belief in the milk carton's consciousness than others. And so some people, it'll only take 5 minutes and they'll stop. Some people will take 5 hours. Some people will take 5 years. And so uh, the point there was to illustrate that different people have different needs emotionally for the amount of engagement that require for them to believe in the entity. And it wasn't specifically the milk carton, really didn't matter.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say the same thing about volcanoes. I don't know anybody who prays to volcano. I know that people have. I'm just saying I'm kind of looking around now and I'm going, what, that isn't around, but I still have 90% of people around me who are praying to a God. And so all those things seem kind of weird disanalogies, but that's okay. We don't have to solve all these things here now. I'm sincerely was puzzled by where that one is going. And I think it may just end up at that point that you have a perception of how those things work that differs from mine. But I'm like, man, it just doesn't seem
Well, I
like.
would like to try one more time. So the
Okay.
point of that analogy was not the object. The milk carton didn't matter. It was just it's
No,
an
I get that.
arbitrary object that is not conscious. The point of the analogy
Right.
was people will try to talk to something, and the rate at which they will continue to try to interact with this thing is different for different people. And it doesn't matter if it's a milk carton or an imaginary friend or someone who they think is on the other side of the planet or a broken internet connection. Like when you're on a call and you say hello, are you there? Some people will say hello more times than others and continue to try to bridge the connection before hanging up. So the only part of the analogy there was that different people take different amounts of interaction before they give up. Now,
Right.
that was the only part. The milk carton, literally not a part of the analogy that was relevant whatsoever.
Yeah. I no, totally get that. I'm just saying the weird thing is that you have people who keep doing this for an entire lifetime, like with your phone call message. Totally get it. At some point you burn out on your phone calling. I've never met anyone who says hello for their entire life. It seems like we have vast quantities of people. So I'm just puzzled. What's the difference about God in those stories? That doesn't make God true. I simply marvel at how different it is about how persistent the God thing is compared to all these other inanimate, non-sentient, non-responsive objects.
Well, I think that goes back to what Tim was saying, that when I brought up the fact that more poor people buy lottery tickets because they're desperate and they need a long shot. Many people in the world are suffering and in need of some kind of security, of this hope for life after death, this hope for eternal justice and morality. And because they are in need of that, they are more likely to cling to a belief in a milk carton that hypothetically will provide these things. And so that's the reason why people will remain religious and are more likely to be religious in more impoverished countries. And as you solve hunger and as you solve death, once we do solve death, the amount of religious people is going to drop significantly because we no longer have those crutches that we need a safety net for. And so the reason
But
people
Tom,
do is because of the safety net.
if Francis Collins were here right now, the head of the Genome Project, America's scientist, or William Lane Craig were here, I find I mean that'd be a hard argument to make with a William Lane Craig, Thomas Aquinas, Leibniz. I suspect they're going to want to come back at you pretty quick to say, so you think because of my desperation, I've come up with these philosophical arguments is just merely a desperate see, that to
I
me is where that's where it starts to go south a little bit for me is, I mean, we have some amazing intellect scientists, pick any realm, and you've got people who believe in theism.
and perhaps more relevantly on that is just to say, I think if you look at like the statistical base of the United States and ask the question, are people who are theists more likely to be desperate, poor, impoverished, or whatever? I'm like, not really. Usually religious belief and practice is an indicator of better mental health and things like that. It isn't obviously exclusive, but there's certainly people who are traumatized by their religion. There's certainly people who are absolute geniuses who are religious, but it seems like a great big bell-shaped curve in the middle isn't actually a bunch of people who only believe in God because of how desperate their situation is, but they're actually just doing fine and still believe and worship God and find it to be an extremely meaningful part of their life. And those are the people I'm missing with the milk carton thing. But again, we can let that one go because we're probably going to, so any other comments you want to make on that before we leave that part?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is that this is meant to be the populace, the reason that the vast majority of the population would more likely believe than not believe. So the fact that there are some outliers wouldn't be surprising. Secondly, Francis Collins' conversion story, was he saw a waterfall that broke into 3 shapes, and you identified that with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So yes, I think that most likely his justifications are a kind of crutch too. But I think that the more important thing, even in America, the less educated people are more likely to be religious. So yes, the more impoverished you are, the more likely you are to be religious. The more educated, as you go up the academic ladder, the less religious people there are. Same as true in scientific fields. But the important thing there is that if we could solve death, do you really think most people would still be religious? Because I think no. I think if we're done with death, no one needs to believe in heaven anymore.
Oh yeah, I do think people would be religious still. In other words, I think there's like a great big positive benefit of religion just on an ongoing basis. In fact, Tim and I are now getting officially old enough that we hang around with people who are dealing with cancer, maybe it's stage 4 cancer, looking at the prospect of death in the eye. So we spend a lot of time thinking about religion connected to death. But for most of my life, I lived in kind of blissful, almost willful, sometimes ignorance of the idea that my life might one day end. And I was just sort of enjoying the presence of God in the middle of my daily life. It wasn't a solution to that, and seemed to be true of an awful lot of the people around me as well in my, churches and places where I worked and served.
Gosh, I think it'll be interesting to see the future, what happens. But I'm willing to make a bet that as we solve death, there will be less and less religious people.
We're going to make that bet with you, Tom, right now, and we will check in every year until Rick and I can't check in anymore.
There you go.
And I think, sadly, we're going to hit that quicker than you, Tom. Hey, Tom, very quickly. So I appreciate your candor on your channel to say that you cannot prove God does not exist. And we're in that camp too. We can't prove he exists, of course, but you can't prove that he doesn't. So what is it that gives you the most confidence? Like, is there, like Rick and I would both have certain arguments and personal experience with God, feeling like we have experienced him. But what would be the thing that gives you confidence that the atheist perspective, is there an argument, a particular viewpoint that you just find like, okay, this is my go-to that really does solidify things for me?
Yeah, it'd be the difference between discovered properties and asserted properties. Pretty much all the arguments come down to this. An explanation of any phenomenon is better explained by a combination of discovered properties than of a hypothesis that includes any asserted properties. God's properties are all asserted properties. Non-physical mind, omnis, all of the omnis outside of space-time, none of those have been confirmed. And so the positing a God as existing is about as equivalent as positing a leprechaun or Santa as existing. All of the properties of those things are also asserted, not discovered. The magic of Santa, magic of leprechaun, all asserted. There's no discovered properties in that thing. And so any hypothesis that you posit that is all asserted properties is rational to believe is purely imaginary. It's a figment of people's imaginations. You're completely justified in believing if somebody has posited a hypothesis of primarily or all asserted properties, you're really rationally justified in believing it's purely a figment of their imagination. And for that reason, I think all God concepts are probably imaginary.
Can I make a quick comment from a communication perspective? Then I'll kick it over to my philosopher friend.
Sure.
Remember we had that great exchange, and I encourage listeners, go back and read segment 1 of our discussion with you. Remember that thing at the very end where I said, hey, Tom, what is it that Christian communicators do that kind of rankles the atheist community? And you gave some, I think, great suggestions. Let me be candid and say what rankles the Christian community is when our belief in God gets put in with leprechauns and Santa Claus. So just from a purely like when you say that, I have to take a deep breath, take a sip of my coffee, and go, I'm with the Winsome Conviction Project. So that's an interesting communication point. That's a hard one for our community to take, because it feels. Do you understand how we
Oh,
feel like that
absolutely,
feels
absolutely. So I think I
alien?
actually mentioned that in our last conversation. I said most Christians think that this comparison is an insult, and I don't mean it that way. The reason I say this is because I think there is an actual one-to-one correlation here, which is about the ontology of the properties of the thing. So what God is made of is asserted properties. And what leprechauns are made of is asserted properties. So the comparison I'm making here isn't meant to be an insult, it's meant to be a literal comparison. So just like how many people on the left will just immediately be triggered by someone who says trans women aren't women without actually considering the logic behind the argument, I think that many Christians do the same thing when they hear God compared to leprechauns without actually considering the logic of the argument. So again, the logic of my argument here is that both of those things are made of asserted properties, and asserted properties aren't rational to believe in.
But I would only say that it's the sender receiver. So you get to send your message however you want to send it. But for me to receive it, if the goal of this, which I believe is your heart, is the goal of this to have productive conversations, if you're sending it in a way that puts up an immediate emotional roadblock, then I think I would try, like if I did something that I knew really rankled you, but I thought it was a legitimate argument, but I just knew that it put what we call communication noise. I think it'd be incumbent upon me as a communicator to find a way of presenting this that didn't create immediate communication noise and distractions. So that's just coming from the communication professor side of me, is that's you're creating noise as you're trying to make the argument, and I might want to try to find a way to make the argument without creating the noise that I have to work through to focus on your argument, if that makes sense.
A quick question on that. Can you name something that is made of only asserted properties that we could compare to God that you wouldn't find insulting?
Let me just say this real quick. Rick?
Well,
No, that's a great. No, Rick, that's a great question. What comes to mind? Anything
well,
comes to mind?
so you know, building things up from the way you distinguish these, asserted properties versus, what was the other phrase you used from
Discovered and asserted.
Yeah, things that you would find. My sense of discovered when you're saying that is very kind of naturalistic, materialistic kind of things that go bump in the night kind of properties. And I'm like, I remember when in my philosophy program, doing a thing on the ontological argument for the existence of God, which never seemed very compelling to me. Um, Even though as a theist, I was like, yeah, that just is a squirrely argument. But I was reading some things where people talked about, you know, the difficulty of figuring out the nature of things like, what is it, the 13? I don't know how many prime numbers we found, but whatever. Let's say we found 13 prime numbers. Is there a 14th prime number? Well, that's actually an objective question. There's a reality about that, presumably. But where in the world would that 14th prime number exist? Does it go bump in the night? Is it in occupying some grand mind in the sky? If it's a discovery, where is that prime number lodged? And you begin to discover a whole set of things that we have a really hard time giving a good account of. And some of these are mundane things like, what in the world is time? It's a weird thing. Is time moving infinitely into the past, or is it moving into the future? Is it not moving at all? What is time? And we have all these sorts of things that are really hard to give an account of, but wildly important to us. And so I think there's a lot of things that kind of have an ambiguous status relative to your descriptive discovered properties, and the asserted properties. I'm not sure that distinction, it's handy, but I don't think it does as much work as you think it does. So that would be my concern with that response. I'm also noticing for us that we are at the end of our time. You have I'm getting a high sign from my friend Tim here.
But
Comment, Tim?
Tom, we're going to give you last comment.
Oh yeah, sure. So I think numbers are conceptual; they aren't properties. So numbers are fully explained. Analytic things purely explained. Time is physical. Einstein covered that one. That has been discovered. So time, space, and time have been very demonstrably demonstrated. So I think those are both very well explained. I think everything that we know of can be well explained in this context, which is why the vast majority of high-leveled experts in the Royal Society and National Academy of Science are both are all very, very naturalist, because it does seem to explain all these things very well. And I think you would need to justify an epistemology that in a new way that we haven't discovered yet in order to make those kinds of claims rational or at the same level as the physicalist interpretation.
Tom, where can people find more of your information perspective, your YouTube channel?
YouTube.com/TJump. Please invite me to speeches and lectures and debates all over the place. I'm always looking for more people to talk with. I'm happy to go anywhere. Just let me know.
Hey, here's what I appreciate about our conversation, Tom, and I would encourage people to go back to listen to segment 1. We didn't just talk about content. We talked about the relational side of this whole journey. And I think both of those are really important. And I'm really glad that in these 2 segments, we didn't just talk about concepts, ideas, falsifiability, but we also talked a little bit about how to talk to each other. And I think both of those conversations are really helpful. And we would love to explore that with you more in the future if you're up for it.
Absolutely. Anytime. Just let me know.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Tom. And from now on, please refer to me as T Mule. That's going to be my new handle. Okay. TJump.
I'm sure we can turn that into something dirty in my chat.
Tom, please don't do that. Whatever else you do, please don't do that. Tim doesn't need that.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for
Absolutely.
joining us for the Winsome Conviction podcast. And we encourage you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever it is that you may be getting your podcasts. And also check us out at the winsomeconviction.com website. Thanks for being there.